Maple Systems thanks you for joining us. Please make sure to have Easy Builder Pro version 6.04.02 or later. In this tutorial, we are going to create a recipe in MS SQL Database, MySQL Database, and how to configure in EB Pro. First, let's create a recipe in MS SQL Database. Open SQL Server Management Studio. We're going to create a new database. Then create a new table. This is where the recipe is created. The first column should be number as the unique ID of the recipe. Every time you add a new row in your recipe, the ID will be increased automatically. Now, we can add the column of recipe one by one with column name and data type. Set the number column as the identify column. Set the number column as primary key. Make sure to set primary key and identify columns. Save the table after you create each recipe column. Now we can add the recipe into the table we just created. When we set database server in EB Pro, the IP is the PC IP address where the database is installed. If you're running online simulation, you can use 127.0.01. The port is not always 1433 of your MS SQL database. Now, you'll need to open SQL Server Configuration Manager. In this instance, 3810 is the actual port of your MS SQL database. The username and password is the one you use to log into SQL Server Management Studio. Database name is the name of the database we just created. Create recipe in MySQL Database. Now, let's create a recipe in MySQL Database. Open MySQL Workbench. Create a new schema. Schema is what they call database in MySQL. Create a new table. Name the first column as number. This is the unique ID of this recipe. Make sure PK and AI options are checked, which stands for primary key and auto increment. Now, we can add the recipe into the table we just created. Press Apply to save the settings. Now, we can add the recipe into the table we just created. Press Apply to save the settings. When we set database server in EB Pro, the IP is the PC's IP where the database is installed. For online simulation, the IP is 127.0.0.1. The default port of my SQL database is usually 3306. Username and password is the same for logging into MySQL Workbench. Database name is the name of the schema we just created. After creating the recipes in the database, we'll configure EBPro. Set the database information correctly. Make sure the status address is not repeatedly used. Create a new SQL query. Fill in the correct table name. Make sure the schema address is not repeatedly used. Press Import from Server. The recipes table is imported. Each address shows the value of each recipes column. Go to the Command tab, set the control address, and make sure the address is not repeatedly used. The command address is where you would input the command ID, which are the basic commands of recipe: CRUD create, read, update, delete. Go to the project window and create a SQLquery result viewer object. Choose the SQL query you just created. Put the numeric object to show each column's recipe value. The addresses of numeric objects are the addresses of the recipe columns. Put the control address of SQLquery to read, write, update, and delete the recipes. It's the address in SQLquery's command tab. Let's run online simulation to see how it works. In SQLquery, the value of read command is 2. So we will put 2 in the control address. Then we can see the recipe value is read from SQL Database on PC. Select different rows, and you can see the value will also be shown in the column addresses. If we want to change the recipe in certain rows, change the value of each column in the numeric object. Then input value 3 in the control address, which is the command of replace. Give read command 2 to update the result. This concludes our demo of how to use SQLquery functions basic mode to achieve recipe sharing. Thanks for watching.